November 8th, 1943, 04:21 hours. North Atlantic 506010N, 30 to 45W. The steel hum of diesel engines vibrated through the deck plates of U-613 as Kapitän Leutnant Ernst Vollmer pressed his eye to the attack periscope. The sea was black, wind force 6, with waves climbing 4 to 5 meters. Ahead, less than 1,000 meters away, the silhouette of a Liberty ship appeared and vanished behind sheets of spray. Vollmer counted its escort pattern. He believed there were only 2 destroyer escorts, both running predictable sweeps. For the first time all night, he thought he had found a gap. At 0422 hours, he ordered the helmsman to bring the bow 2 degrees to port and hold depth at 14 meters. The weapon officer stood ready, 4 G7E torpedoes in the forward tubes, each with a 280-kilogram warhead. Vollmer calculated the merchant's speed at 9 knots. The destroyers were farther out, maybe 2,500 meters. A quick launch, a fast dive, and then a silent run on electric motors could carry them beneath the thermal layer. Escape seemed possible if everything happened within a tight 45-second window. But when he raised the periscope again, he noticed a faint flicker, too regular, too stable to be moonlight on waves. It pulsed at exact intervals, 12 pulses, a pause, then 12 again. Radar. Surface radar, likely from one of the new Allied escorts. Vollmer felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. The horizon looked empty, but he now understood the threat was no longer visible. A ship could see him without eyes, through cloud, through darkness, through the folds of the sea. He whispered a single word, Tiefenfahrt. Take her down. Before the dive klaxon faded, an explosive splash echoed on the starboard side. A pattern of 12 depth charges entered the water at precise intervals of 2 seconds, falling fast, each weighing around 200 pounds. Vollmer had seconds, 45 seconds at most, before they detonated. He ordered 160 meters, bow down 10 degrees. The motors whined, tools rattled against bulkheads, men clutched piping as the boat angled sharply. The charge pattern was still descending, guided not by guesswork but by machines. In those 45 seconds, Vollmer's view of the Atlantic shifted forever. It was no longer an ocean of shadows and seamanship. It was a battlefield of signals, frequencies, algorithms, and industrial output measured in millions of tons. The next phase of the U-boat war would not be decided by periscope skill, but by factories, laboratories, and escort carriers steaming hundreds of miles away. And as U-613 plunged beneath the waves, racing the descending charges, Vollmer realized he was facing something far more dangerous than any destroyer he had ever seen on the horizon. The story of how he reached this moment began months earlier, when U-boat doctrine still treated the mid-Atlantic as a hunting ground instead of a trap engineered by Allied industry and intelligence. By the spring of 1943, Ernst Vollmer had completed 3 patrols as first watch officer aboard U-131, part of Gruppe Drachen. He earned command of U-613 in March, a Type 7C boat with a surface displacement of 769 tons and a submerged displacement of 871 tons. She carried 14 torpedoes, a single 88mm deck gun, twin 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, and could reach 17.7 knots on the surface. But beneath the technical specifications lay a more sobering reality. The Type 7C design was essentially unchanged from 1939, while the Allied anti-submarine system evolved every month. Vollmer's first patrol as commander began at 10:30 hours on April 12, 1943, departing Kiel under gray skies. The boat carried 60 tons of diesel fuel, enough for a long Atlantic patrol if carefully managed. The crew consisted of 44 men, including machinists, radio men, torpedo specialists, and cooks. Their instructions were clear. Operate in the North Atlantic air gap, the region once too far from both British and American air coverage. But unknown to them, the gap had been shrinking rapidly due to the introduction of very long-range B-24 Liberators equipped with ASV Mark III radar. During the outbound voyage through the Bay of Biscay, U-613 encountered its first sign that conditions had changed. On April 17th at 0410 hours, while surfaced to recharge batteries, the radio man detected a brief spike on the METOX radar warning receiver. A second spike followed at a slightly higher frequency. The officer of the watch ordered an immediate crash dive. 38 seconds after the boat submerged, a lee light illuminated the surrounding water as a B-24 passed overhead. No bombs fell. The pilot had lost the boat's exact position, but the message was unmistakable. The Allied air patrols were no longer constrained by daylight or weather. As U-613 moved deeper into the Atlantic during late April and early May, Vollmer followed the standard doctrine. Slow-speed patrols at 2 to 3 knots during daylight hours at 50 meters depth, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and send brief signal reports to BDU using the Enigma machine. But the enemy was no longer dependent on direction finding alone. High-frequency HF radio detection equipment on Allied escort ships could pinpoint U-boat transmissions within minutes. Time frames that once gave commanders freedom to send situational updates were now dangerously narrow. Several times in early May, the hydrophone operator detected distant propeller signatures, four-bladed screws rotating steadily, indicating escort-class vessels maintaining patrol lines. Convoys were no longer scattered targets. They now moved in coordinated formations, guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers, such as the USS Bogue, which could launch aircraft hundreds of miles from any land base. At 16:30 hours on May 21st, Vollmer received encrypted orders assigning U-614 to a wolf pack called Trutzfrimmers, part of Admiral Donitz's plan to reassert U-boat pressure against the growing Allied shipping stream. Trutz would operate east of Newfoundland along a grid in the North Atlantic. But this plan underestimated two critical factors: Allied code breaking at Bletchley Park, which read portions of the naval Enigma traffic, and an industrial tempo that delivered dozens of escort vessels and long-range aircraft every month. On May 24th, while surfaced at 2155 hours, U-613 sighted the faint smoke of a convoy approximately 9 miles away. Vollmer maneuvered parallel to the formation, attempting to overtake it under cover of darkness, but before he could achieve firing position, a Catalina patrol aircraft detected the boat via radar. 2 depth charges fell near the bow, forcing U-613 to break contact. The escort ships quickly repositioned, using radar and sonar to sweep the area. The convoy remained untouched. By early June, Vollmer recognized that his boat was no longer a hunter in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a fugitive, moving through a network of detection systems. He ordered his crew to shorten surface intervals and avoid radio transmissions whenever possible. On June 8th, at 03:15 hours, while the crew ventilated the boat and loaded fresh air into the tanks, the hydrophone operator detected aircraft engines approaching rapidly. The bridge watch spotted a silhouette descending. Vollmer dived immediately. Seconds later, 6 depth charges detonated above them, rattling bolts loose in the control room. Despite damage to the forward hydrophone array and minor leaks, U-613 continued northward, avoiding major contacts for several weeks. Yet fuel reserves were dropping. By August, Vollmer needed to engage a convoy to justify the patrol's cost and to refuel from a Milchkuh supply submarine. But the supply boats were now prime targets monitored by Allied air patrols. 2 had been sunk in July alone. In September 1943, U-613 finally received intelligence of a moderately protected convoy moving westward. Vollmer positioned the boat ahead of the formation at 2,000 hours on September 14th. But once again, Allied radar detected the periscope awake during an approach. A destroyer escort dropped 5 depth charge patterns over the next hour, each increasingly accurate. U-613 escaped only by descending to 180 meters, far deeper than its recommended operational depth of 100 meters. These repeated encounters forced Vollmer to reevaluate his tactics. He divided approaches into 3 phases: a radar avoidance phase, a submerged shadowing phase, and a high-risk attack phase. But by October 1943, even this revised method depended on assumptions that no longer held true. Convoys now carried robust air cover, escorts were equipped with improved Type 271 radar, and sonar operators had refined techniques for identifying false contacts. By early November, with fuel at 35% and supplies dwindling, Vollmer decided on a final attempt. He intercepted a convoy moving eastbound, escorted by at least 3 warships and supported by air patrols. The weather was poor, with overcast skies and heavy seas. In earlier years, such conditions favored U-boat attacks. Now, they merely reduced the boat's ability to spot aircraft before radar-guided attacks commenced. U-613 approached at periscope depth on the night of November 7th, using the storm to mask its movement. At 2350 hours, the sonar operator identified multiple contacts: steady propeller rhythms from merchant ships and the more distinctive pulsing signatures of escorts maintaining protective arcs. Vollmer calculated their average spacing at 1,800 to 2,000 meters. He believed he could exploit the gap between 2 of them. As the night progressed into early morning, U-613 maneuvered into firing position. The seas were rough. Periscope observations were difficult. But by 04:15 hours on November 8th, Vollmer believed he had found the moment, a brief, narrow corridor between escorts. That led directly to the moment described earlier: the flicker of radar pulses, the urgent order to dive, the cascade of depth charges falling toward him. The entire Atlantic battlefield had shifted under his feet, reshaped by technologies and production systems far beyond the control of any single captain. The depth charges detonated at 0422 hours, the first concussions arriving like hammer blows along the starboard side. The boat lurched, lights flickered, and a rain of rust particles drifted from the overhead piping. Vollmer gripped the chart table edge, counting the rhythm of the blasts. 12 charges in the pattern, spaced evenly. set for a medium depth. This was no random attack. The escort had calculated his position to within tens of meters, accuracy no destroyer had achieved when Vollmer first went to sea in 1941. By 0424 hours, U-613 had reached 80 meters, descending at a 10-degree angle. The chief engineer throttled the electric motors to achieve 3 knots, the safe limit for silent running. Helm reported minor flooding in compartment 3, controlled by the bilge pumps. Vollmer gave no new orders. He simply listened. The sonar operator heard the screws of an approaching escort closing from the northwest, traveling at approximately 18 knots. The escort was not guessing. It was triangulating. At 0427 hours, a second pattern entered the water. This one consisted of 8 charges, likely from a Hedgehog projector. Unlike depth charges, Hedgehog bombs detonated only upon direct contact, landing in a tight ellipse ahead of the attacking ship. Vollmer knew that surviving a Hedgehog strike depended on precision, holding depth exactly, making no abrupt maneuver. The bombs descended silently around them. None detonated. At 0430 hours, the sonar operator identified another set of screws farther out, 2-bladed, steady cadence, indicating a corvette maintaining a blockade on the opposite side of the convoy. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the noise of an aircraft engine. A single-engine patrol plane, likely a Swordfish or Avenger, launched from an escort carrier positioned somewhere beyond. The horizon. Multiple detection systems, radar from the surface, sonar in the water, radio direction finders, and aircraft radar overhead were converging on their position. A U-boat that once hunted alone now faced a coordinated network capable of tracking it continuously, even without visual contact. Vollmer lowered his head slightly, absorbing the truth of it. The war had become a contest of machines connected to other machines. At 0435 hours, he ordered a depth of 160 meters. This was beyond the official operational limit, but necessary. The hull creaked as seawater pressure increased. Some younger crewmen glanced upward involuntarily, imagining the weight of the ocean bearing down upon the steel. Vollmer kept his eyes forward. He had run deep before, but never while surrounded by so many converging threats. At 0441 hours, the destroyer escort resumed its search pattern, now dropping charges in pairs, spaced 300 meters apart. These were not attempts to hit U-613 directly, but to pressure the submarine into maneuvering, forcing it to reveal itself on sonar. Vollmer countered by ordering a hard starboard turn at minimal speed, altering course by 40 degrees while maintaining silence as much as possible. This created a deceptive wake that might complicate sonar interpretation. For a moment, it worked. At 0450 hours, the sonar operator reported that one of the escorts had passed beyond accurate detection range. The aircraft overhead, however, remained in the vicinity. Aircraft had become the decisive factor. They moved at 100 to 150 knots, covering vast search arcs with radar that could detect a periscope head from miles away. Even submerged submarines were vulnerable to sonobuoys. Hydrophones dropped from aircraft and floating canisters. At 0503 hours, the boat trembled again, this time only lightly. A distant explosion, then another. The enemy was now saturating the area, creating a barrier of detonations that made it dangerous to ascend toward periscope depth. Vollmer considered surfacing and fighting with the 20-meter guns, but discarded the thought immediately. The aircraft would sink them within minutes. Instead, he decided on a maneuver used rarely in earlier years: total silence. At 0505 hours, he ordered the chief engineer to shut down all non-essential systems. No bilge pumps, no air compressors, no battery ventilation beyond what was necessary to prevent gas buildup. The submarine adopted a crawl, barely perceptible motion, using only the aft electric motor at its lowest setting. The boat slipped deeper, stabilizing at 170 meters. From 0510 to 0550 hours, the crew endured a tense wait as sonar pings echoed from multiple directions. The difference now was unmistakable. In 1941, escort pings were broad, imprecise, and often misinterpreted. In 1943, Allied sonar sets like the Type 144 had improved resolution, and trained operators could distinguish decoys from real contacts. Vollmer sensed they were being bracketed, not precisely, located but constrained within a zone of ocean no more than a kilometer wide. At 0557 hours, the pressure hull groaned again. A trickle of seawater emerged near a flange and compartment frew. The engineer applied a patch. Vollmer knew they could not sustain this depth indefinitely. Batteries would deplete, CO2 levels would rise. Eventually they would need to surface or snorkel, and Allied aircraft would be waiting. The escort ships continued sweeping in wide arcs, tightening the circle. At 0615 hours, the sonar operator detected rapid screw changes from the nearest escort, an indication of an attack run. Vollmer anticipated a depth charge pattern, but instead heard a new sound: metallic splashes spaced at irregular intervals. The British had introduced acoustic torpedoes, such as the Mark 24 Fido, deployed from aircraft. These homing torpedoes locked onto propeller noise. Their range was short, less than 1,000 meters, but their accuracy was lethal. Vollmer responded instantly. At 0617 hours, he ordered the boat to reduce speed to absolute minimum and then executed a sudden decoy maneuver, releasing a bold canister. The canister emitted streams of chemical bubbles, simulating submarine noise and confusing acoustic homing mechanisms. Vollmer set a slow upward angle to change depth by 15 meters, altering acoustic signature subtly but significantly. Seconds later, the crew heard the torpedo pass astern, missing by what sounded like meters. At 0625 hours, the sonar operator reported the nearest escorts pulling away. The aircraft engine faded. Vollmer exhaled once, slowly. They had weathered the first coordinated assault. But the larger truth remained: surviving one wave did not guarantee escape. The convoy system could pass contact reports for hours, and reinforcements could arrive from hundreds of miles away. The ocean, once empty, had become an interconnected grid. Between 0700 and 8:30 hours, U-613 crept southward, using the thermal layers to mask sonar returns. Vollmer aimed to exit the immediate search area before surfacing. Batteries were at 38%. Air quality was worsening. CO2 absorbent cartridges were in use. At 0845 hours, he risked descending to 90 meters. No sonar pings nearby, no aircraft engines audible. The sea above seemed momentarily empty. Vollmer allowed himself a brief hope that the pursuit had shifted north in response to false echoes. At 0910 hours, he ordered periscope depth. As the boat rose, the crew waited in total silence. At 0917 hours, the U-boat leveled off at 14 meters. Vollmer extended the periscope cautiously, just 5 centimeters above the surface. The lens broke through, and immediately he froze. Barely 100 meters away, an escort destroyer steamed directly toward their position. Its bow sliced the waves cleanly, leaving no doubt. The destroyer had been waiting. It had held a position along the predicted escape path, guided not by luck, but by coordinated intelligence and radar plots shared among Allied ships. At 0918 hours, the destroyer accelerated. White spray rose along its hull. Vollmer shouted for a crash dive. The periscope slammed down. The helmsman executed a 15-degree down angle. Men grabbed stanchions as the boat pitched. At 0920 hours, the destroyer released its pattern. 24 depth charges entered the water, arranged in a staggered formation to compensate for thermal layers. The first explosions hit at 60 meters, the second wave at 90 meters. A third set, deeper still, ruptured piping in compartment 2. A small electrical fire ignited and was extinguished. By 0926 hours, pressure damage accumulated. Rivets strained. U-614 reached 185 meters, its deepest descent yet. The hull shuddered. Even Vollmer's hardened expression changed as he recognized the limit. Another 10 meters and the steel might deform catastrophically. At 0930 hours, he ordered the boat to level at 175 meters. The crew worked to stabilize the systems, conserve battery, and restore partial maneuvering. The sonar operator detected the destroyer circling again. This time, however, the acoustic picture changed. The escort was not preparing another depth charge run. It was holding a stationary pattern, waiting for support. Additional escorts, possibly from the convoy's trailing screen, were moving toward the area. At 0955 hours, faint aircraft hums returned. The destroyer had summoned air support again. The aircraft would drop more sonobuoys, creating an acoustic net. Vollmer saw the board shift completely. The escorts no longer needed to know his exact position. They only needed to keep him submerged until batteries were depleted or air ran out. Time was now their greatest weapon. At 10:15 hours, he gathered his officers in the control room. He spoke quietly, acknowledging the realities. They would continue south, maintain silence, and avoid detection as long as possible. But breaking free of the Allied grid seemed increasingly unlikely. The men understood without speaking. At 11:30 hours, U-613 attempted a slow ascent to 150 meters. No pings, no engines. At 12:05 hours, they reached 120 meters. Still quiet. Vollmer dared to hope one last time. At 12:12 hours, 6 sonobuoy beacons activated above them, tiny splashes spaced precisely. The pattern was unmistakable. A patrolling aircraft had dropped them in a grid. The submarine was boxed again. At 12:14 hours, the first sonar ping struck the hull with startling clarity. Not from a surface ship, but from a sonobuoy transmitting upward to the aircraft overhead, which relayed the signal to the escorts. At 12:16 hours, the destroyer returned. It accelerated to attack speed. At 12:20 hours, the depth charge barrage began. Patterns of 12, then 8, then 20. The sea became a continuous wall of thunder. Compartments buckled. A seam in the aft battery room ruptured. Chlorine gas began to accumulate. At 12:24 hours, Vollmer made the only decision left. He ordered ballast blown. The boat surged. Upward, not to fight, not to escape, but to save the crew by reaching the surface before the gas rendered them unconscious. At 1227 hours, U-613 broke through the wave's bow first, listing heavily. The destroyer closed to 400 meters. The crew scrambled topside to surrender. White flags rose. At 1229 hours, with the last surviving men evacuated, the U-boat slipped beneath the waves. Whether from accumulated damage or scuttling charges set by the engineering crew, she sank stern first, disappearing at 50 30 to 45 W. For Ernst Vollmer, captured and taken aboard the destroyer, the 45 seconds that revealed the pulsing radar signal earlier that morning had foretold everything that followed. The Atlantic was no longer an expanse defined by seamanship, stealth, and isolated duels. It had become a synchronized battle space shaped by air power, industrial output, electronics, and code breaking. Courage still mattered. Training still mattered. But the systems behind the escorts, the factories producing radar sets, the laboratories refining sonar, the shipyards launching escort carriers, the analysts decrypting signals, had become decisive. U-613 did not fall because of one destroyer or one aircraft. It fell because the Allies had built an interconnected machine that turned the largest ocean on Earth into a monitored grid. The lesson was stark. Individual skill could win a moment. Systems would win the war. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.